Good morning and welcome to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. It is Thursday, September 21st at 10 a.m. and we are here this morning for an allowable ex parte. We need to clarify something, so we're going off air for a second until we can get this corrected. Thank you. Good morning again, and thank you for your patience. We're having a little bit of technical difficulty this morning, but as I stated, we are here today for an allowable ex parte communication briefing in ND-2023-46-E. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. Apologies, we are still having a little bit of reverb. We need to go offline again to try to correct this microphone issue. Thank you. Good morning, and welcome back to the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. We are here for an allowable ex parte communication in ND-2023-46-E. I appreciate everyone's patience. We've had a few technical difficulties this morning, but hopefully those are straightened out now. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. With us virtually, we have Commissioner Irvin and Commissioner Thomas. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Justin Williams, Commissioner Carolee Williams, Commissioner Caston, and Chair Belser. I note that Vice Chair Powers is on medical leave today, sick leave. And with that, let's see, who's here for the presenters?
Madam Chair, good morning. Court Walsh, counsel for CVSC, Conservation Voters of South Carolina. In addition to me, I have Jalen Brooks Nepley from Conservation Voters of South Carolina and Mr. Tyler Norris.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh, and welcome, Mr. Walsh and panelists. And who is here as our neutral?
Good morning, Chair Belser and Commissioners. Joshua Alston on behalf of ORS as the Executive Director's designee.
Thank you, Mr. Alston. I will now recognize our General Counsel to state as I call them, the ground rules of an allowable ex parte communication briefing.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning, Commissioners, and to everyone who's present here today. Today is Thursday, September 21st, 2023, and we are here in the Commission's hearing room pursuant to a notice of a request for an allowable ex parte briefing from the Conservation Voters of South Carolina in non-docket 2023-46-E. The subject matter noticed to be discussed today is how other states have reliably integrated renewable energy onto their grids. I would like to remind everyone that this is a briefing and not a hearing. The briefing must be conducted in compliance with the provisions of South Carolina Code Section 58-3-260C, and the requirements of that statute are, in part, that the allowable ex parte briefing must be confined to the subject matter which has been noticed. I would therefore ask the presenters, commissioners, and staff to please refrain from discussing any matters not related to the specific topics. The statute also prohibits any presenter, commissioner, or commission staff from requesting or giving any comment, predetermination, or prediction regarding any action by any commissioner as to an ultimate issue which either is or is likely to come before the commission. I would also ask that the presenters, staff, and commissioners refrain from referencing any report, article, statute, or document of any kind that are not included in today's presentation. A copy of any document that is referenced during the briefing must be provided to the Office of Regulatory Staff for inclusion into the record, which must be certified by the Clerk of the Commission, Ms. Jocelyn Boyd. If anyone during the course of this briefing exceeds the scope or does not comply with or fails to conduct themselves within the provisions of South Carolina Code Section 58-3-260 governing the allowable ex parte briefings, it is expected that a contemporaneous objection will be made. Everyone in attendance today must sign in and register, and as you were entering the hearing room, you also were given a form to read, sign, and return at the door, and you were also given instructions and the deadline for how to return that form. It is required by law for each attendee to certify the requirements contained in Section 58-3-260C have been complied with in this presentation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Hill. Mr. Austin, do you have anything to add to the instructions as the neutral?
No, Chair Belser, Ms. Hill was very thorough. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Austin. Mr. Walsh, we'll recognize you to take over.
Chair Belser, thank you. Members of the Commission, thank you. Good to see you again. I think this is probably the third or fourth ex parte briefing that we have had for Conservation of Voters of South Carolina in front of you. From the previous experiences, I don't expect to talk very much or even at all. I guess the only sort of public service announcement I make is that if we've always had such good questions generated from the briefings. If for some reason I do need to gently object or interject because of the scope, that's probably the only time you'll hear from me the rest of the morning. But what I'll do now is I'll get out of the way so that the folks with real information can start to provide that to you. And so I'll turn it over to my friend and colleague, Ms. Brooks Nepley.
Good morning. My name is Jalen, as Court said, and I'm an Energy Project Manager for CVSC. I want to thank you, Commissioners, for taking the time to participate in this briefing, and also thank the PSC staff for their efforts getting us set up today, and the Office of Regulatory staff for taking time to be here as well. We're excited to be back at the PSC today. I'm just going to give a brief introduction, and then I'll hand things over to our main speaker, Tyler Norris. In past briefings, we've discussed the managed charging of electric vehicles, natural gas price volatility, and energy efficiency. All these topics center on ways to improve the energy system in South Carolina. Today, we want to bring you one more topic on that theme, the reliable integration of renewables onto the electric grid. As you know, the energy sector is changing rapidly, which is why we believe education on these issues is so important. This summer, we've seen record high temperatures across the country, putting strain on the grid. We've seen challenging weather, from extreme summer heat to intense winter storms. And we've seen technologies like wind and solar step in to make up the difference. We're developing ways to make clean energy cheaper, reducing air pollution, and improving health outcomes for surrounding communities. We're also seeing changes in the cost of resources as we look ahead to possible new power plant regulations from the EPA, which seek to strengthen protections for our air and water. At the same time, we're feeling the impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act, which commits funding to clean energy technologies and individual energy efficiency improvements. Closer to home, in South Carolina, we've already seen investments in new manufacturing industries, from electric vehicle batteries to wind turbine cables. So we're looking at a lot of change in our state, but we're not the only ones. We're learning lessons from across the country about what these changes mean for the power grid and how we can rise to new challenges. We want to center this discussion around reliability because I know this commission works to ensure reliable and affordable energy for every ratepayer in South Carolina. And as we examine new technologies, we can find examples of integrating renewable energy in a way that maintains and even enhances grid reliability for customers. So, let me introduce our speaker. Tyler Norris is a James B. Duke Fellow and PhD candidate. He's researching electric power systems at Duke University Nicholas School of the Environment. He holds a BA in public policy from Stanford University and has experience in renewable energy and energy storage markets, including with the U.S. Department of Energy, private solar development companies, and S&P. He has testified before several state utility commissions and has been published in the Harvard Law and Policy Review, the New York Times, and other publications. Tyler developed this presentation in collaboration with GridLab, a research organization that provides technical expertise to energy decision makers on electric grid issues. And with that, I will hand things over to Tyler.
Can you all hear me? Great. Good morning. It's great to be back in Columbia. Is that mic working okay? Great to be back in Columbia. I think the first time I was in this room was in 2018, sort of after the VC summer abandonment, a lot of considerations going on around Act 62, and it was a very different room at that point. I think there was much less audiovisual equipment. I think there was a metal detector in the back, but we're going both through an energy transformation and an AV equipment transformation. So it's impressive to see how far we've come. I want to start by just expressing my gratitude to all of you. I know I can only imagine how complex the job is that you have today and the amount of analysis and data that you have to work through to make the important decisions that you do. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you and take your questions, and hopefully you'll find some of this information and analysis useful for your very important job. So with that, go to the table of contents here. So this is just our basic roadmap for today. So I'll start with an executive summary. We'll spend a little bit of time on a status update around renewable penetration rates across the country and different interconnections and in South Carolina as well. We'll then look at some data around summer versus winter peaking trends, which I think is really valuable to contextualize considerations around the reliability and resource adequacy of variable renewable energy. From there, we'll look more specifically at the interaction of summer peaking events and solar power, and then in addition, solar and storage. And then we'll talk a little bit more specifically about winter resource adequacy and what happens in the face of winter peak events and its interaction with these emerging resources. And, as with any topic like this, there's never enough time to cover all the detail and all the nuance. And so welcome any questions to clarify those points. Obviously, if there's an opportunity to provide any follow-up information that you would find useful, more than happy to do that. And if we don't hit on something, it's not because it may not be valuable. It's just that I think it might be helpful to hit the highlights here, and what I think will be valuable to understand, so the bigger picture, and then as valuable, we can dig into more detail. So with that, this is the summary. I usually don't read slides. I will in this case, just to put it into the record. The good news is most of these slides are very graph and chart heavy. There's not a lot of text, so this is really the only really text heavy slide, I promise. So variable renewable energy, or VRE, I'll use that acronym a few times, VRE just for short, in the form of solar and wind electricity, remain a limited share of generation in most of the United States, with significant headroom for growth, and that includes South Carolina. The U.S. remains a heavily summer peaking system overall, even in the face of unprecedented winter loads. However, individual balancing authorities have seen more instances of winter peaks, but recent summer peak records suggest ongoing uncertainty in this regard. Average summer peaks are significantly higher than average winter peaks, and more summer days tend to be within close range of those summer peaks. Solar is generally a reliable resource in supporting peak summer loads, given the very strong correlation between summer peaks and solar output, as we'll see. In addition, storage enables solar to contribute more toward peak demand and reduce resource adequacy risk, including in winter months. And then finally, recent winter blackouts have demonstrated the vulnerability of fossil generators to extreme winter weather, and we just need to take that into consideration as we think broadly about resource adequacy across different resources. And so from there, we'll go right in. So I thought it'd be helpful just to start off with a look at South Carolina specifically. And so what we're looking at here is the total annual electricity generation from utility scale generators. So by the categorization of the Energy Information Administration, or EIA, that's every generator above 1 megawatt AC in size. In South Carolina, in megawatt hour terms, in the whole year of 2022. So this is the electricity generation mix in 2022 as a share of megawatt hours. And again, this data is from EIA, and it's not capacity, so this is energy. And one of the first things that stands out, of course, is the majority contribution from existing nuclear power. So remarkable, 55% of all megawatt hours came from nuclear last year. The share of nuclear in South Carolina's electricity mix is almost unsurpassed among any state of the country. There's actually only one other state that exceeds South Carolina as a share for nuclear in the energy mix. I didn't realize actually just how high South Carolina is. The answer is it's actually New Hampshire. They're at 59%. But it's not a fair comparison because their electricity generation total is only a fifth of South Carolina's. So this is a very, very high penetration of nuclear generation in the overall mix. And just in case you're wondering, number 3 is Illinois at about 52%. And then from there, it really drops off. So the next is Tennessee at 45%, New Jersey at 44%, and Maryland at 40%. From there, as you would expect, we have our 2 other important thermal resources, so gas at 24% of the electricity mix, coal now at 14%. And so if we take these thermal resources together, combined with biomass, which we can also designate as thermal, right, and that it's using heat, right, to usually drive a turbine, the total share of thermal generation in the mix here last year was a little bit over 95%. So the vast majority of South Carolina's electricity generation is currently coming from these thermal resources. And that leaves a very small minority that's coming from the rest. So 2.4% of all electricity generation, again, from utility scale generators last year came from solar in South Carolina, and 2.2% was from hydro. So there are different ways to look at this. I think in general, we could say that this is a relatively low penetration thus far from variable renewable energy in the overall mix. And as we'll see, other states have achieved higher levels of resource diversification. And so that's just to sort of contextualize. If we go to the next slide, we can see how this compares to the rest of the country. So what we're looking at now is every state in the country, its share of variable renewable electricity, meaning wind and solar, as a share of their state's total electricity generation in 2022. So it's the same view we were looking at in the last slide, except focused on wind and solar as a percentage of overall electricity generation. And what we can see here is, there are a wide range of penetration rates, right? Everything from, in Kentucky, almost 0, all the way, the top state is being Iowa, above 60%, most of that, of course, being wind. You'll notice that the majority of this penetration is wind in most states. So of this U.S. totals, it's 13.7%. So of all U.S. electricity generation, 13.7% is coming from wind and solar. About 10% of that 13.7% is from wind. So it's the substantial majority thus far, although solar is growing more quickly at this point. So we can see that South Carolina, as we just noted, is at 2.4%. There's no wind electricity generation, as we all know, in South Carolina. So 2.4%. It's about 5 times less than that sort of U.S. total average, and it is of course less than several other states in our region. I know it's hard to see the state abbreviations. I apologize. It's hard to get every state in the country on one slide, but if you just go down a few, you can see. So Florida, I think a little over 5%. Actually, kind of a clustering there. So Florida, Virginia, Georgia, all a little bit above 5%. And North Carolina there a little bit closer to 10%. But, on the other hand, we do have, you can see at the very top, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee have still relatively lower penetration rates. That is about to change. Tennessee, as you'll know, TVA has contracted a lot of solar, so a lot of it hasn't come online yet. So we will see that number tick up meaningfully in the next few years. But so overall rank for South Carolina now is number 41 for overall VRE penetration. Okay, so that's kind of looking at penetration rates on the state level. I think it's also instructive, though, to look at this at the level of the interconnections in the U.S., because we are, of course, not an integrated grid across the whole country, right? We have essentially 3 separate grids. And actually, I'll go to the next slide just so get the clicker there we go. Just to make sure we're all grounded here. So you've heard of, the Eastern interconnection, the Western interconnection, and then ERCOT. And so these 3 separate grids are not synchronously connected. They're separate. And so This means, of course, that ERCOT does not have the ability right now to import from the other interconnections, say when they have reliability events occur. That's true as well for the east and west interconnection. There are discussions, right, about potential ways to increase the opportunity for interchange if it were to become valuable in certain instances. But this is what we mean when we say Western interconnection, Eastern interconnection, and then Texas or ERCOT. So what we can see here is that the rate of overall variable renewable penetration in the Eastern interconnection is substantially lower than the Western interconnect and Texas. So when we say the U.S. average is 13.7%, it's good. It's helpful to note that that is being substantially driven by these higher shares in the Western interconnect and in Texas. And so the overall penetration rate for the Eastern interconnection thus far is around 10%, and it's about 2 to 2.5 times less the wind and solar penetration rate in the Western interconnect in Texas. I find it very interesting to look at just some dramatic differences across these mixes. For example, the Western interconnect, you see that other RE bucket, that's hydro and biomass, and you can see how large that is in the Western. They just have an immense amount of hydro resource in the Western interconnect. In Texas, there's hardly any at all, and we do of course have some, and it makes an important contribution in the Eastern interconnect, although not nearly as much as in the Western interconnect. I'd also note it would be valuable to look at this at a balancing authority level, right? So, say for a Dominion, South Carolina, or a TVA, we don't have that data in front of us right here, but that would be another way to look at this that I think would be instructive. Okay, so that sort of rounds us out on a kind of status update on renewable electricity mixes and penetration rates. So now we'll shift gears and talk about winter versus summer peaking trends. And this is very important, I think, to sort of contextualize and understand resource adequacy with respect to variable renewables. So this is a representation of the maximum peaks that have occurred on an annual basis since 2015 for the whole contiguous United States, so all the lower 48 states, both in terms of the summer peak as well as the winter peak that's been hit in each of these years. So when we look at on the far right-hand side, 2022 to 2023, what that means is so the lower number is the peak that was hit for the lower 48 states, the peak hour load, and that was hit on December 24th during Winter Storm Elliott. And so that actually set the maximum instantaneous winter peak load that's ever been hit in the United States. So that is the record. And then the number above it, that's 742 gigawatts, that is the peak record that was set this summer. That's on July 27th. That was a Thursday, and that was between 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern. And this is coincident peak, right? So this is, if you take up all of the load across all of the contiguous 48 states on an instantaneous basis, this is the maximum that's been hit in each of these years. And there are several, I think, valuable things to note about this. The first is that we have seen a meaningful uptick over the past few years in summer peaks overall, again, on an aggregate basis for the lower 48 states. This is very significant. It is actually the first increase in summer peak loads that's really occurred in the last 20 years. So we actually saw a leveling off of summer peaks in aggregate for the United States in around 2005. And we actually saw it drop off. And it looked like it was declining into the mid-2010s. And then we saw that trend reverse, and now it's going back up. And I think there's a general expectation that we will see, again, aggregate summer peak loads continue to grow. The other, of course, important trend to note here is that we are seeing an uptick in the extent of these winter extreme weather events. And so it happens a little less periodically, right? You see these sort of spikes happening in aggregate winter peak load. So it's not every year, it's when we have these more extreme winter weather, occasional events in the form of polar vortexes or similar weather systems. And nevertheless, there is a significant difference between the aggregate summer peak load and the winter peak load. So even during the all-time record that was set during Winter Storm Elliott of approximately 638 gigawatts, that was over 100 gigawatts less than the summer peak that occurred this year at 742. Now, it's very important to note that, of course, individual balancing authorities within the aggregate have a different profile. And so we'll get into that. But I think it's just helpful to start by sort of contextualizing at the national level and then sort of zooming in on individual balancing authorities. So that's the sort of aggregate view. If we go to the next slide. So now we've zoomed in on the Carolinas and our 4 major balancing authorities here. Just to note, this is a representation of all of Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress. It is, as you know, it is quite difficult to sort of parse out the load for each and the generation. And so I think for this purpose, it's valuable to look at the whole, and it may be possible to parse out for the state shares. But in this case, we're looking at the whole. And so these are the 2 most recent summer and winter peak events for each of these utilities. And so the blue bar is the winter peak for each of them that was hit for all of these, actually, it was on December 24th of 2022. So all of their most recent winter peak was hit during Winter Storm Elliott. And then the orange bar is the most recent summer peak for each of them. And you can see in the table in the upper right, each of those varied a little bit, although there was some consistency. So Duke Energy Carolinas was aligned actually with the rest of the country on that July 27th date. DEP was a little different. It was in this range of August 14th to 15th, which is also when the summer peak was hit for Dominion, South Carolina, and for Santee Cooper. And you can also see the timestamp on those. It's very interesting. Usually these peaks, as we expect, occur somewhere between 4 to 6 p.m. I was actually quite surprised to see this data point from Duke Energy Progress of their summer peak actually occurring in the hour ending in 2 p.m. Eastern. That's a little unusual. So query what's driving that. But and then on the winter peak side, as we would expect, these are generally occurring between 6 to 9 a.m. Although it's interesting to see Dominion, South Carolina had that winter peak in the hour ending 10 a.m. That's a little later actually than you would usually expect. And so those are kind of the aggregate volumes. And what we see is, we see a mix here, right? So for Duke Energy Carolinas, the most recent summer peak exceeded the winter peak. For Duke Energy Progress, the winter peak did slightly exceed the recent summer peak. For Dominion, a similar profile to Duke Energy Carolinas, you had the recent summer peak actually exceeded this very significant recent winter peak. And then for Santee, it is more heavily winter weighted. So I think this is a kind of good introduction to some of the variation we're seeing in summer and winter peaks. But of course, you say these are only 2 data points, right? So these are the 2 most recent peaks. What if we go back and look, say, the last 6 to 8 years? And so if we look at the next slide, that's what we have here. So the reason this cuts off in 2015, just for context, is that the Energy Information Administration only started tracking on a systematic basis hourly generation and load data, or at least only publishes it back to July of 2015. So that's the only reason for that cutoff. But it's a valuable data set, right? It's a little over 8 years of hourly load data, and they have it for every balancing authority in the U.S. And so what we've done here is we've taken all of the load hours for the past 8 years, and we've rank ordered them, right? So highest to lowest, and then we've taken different slices of those max peak load hours. And so we have a representation of the top 5, the top 10, and the top 100 for each of these balancing authorities. And then we're looking at the percent of those hours that occurred in winter months versus summer months, right? So basically looking at what is the share of the past 8 years in which these utilities have actually peaked in winter months as opposed to summer months. And so what we see is actually relatively consistent with what you just saw, and that there's really a diversity occurring here across these balancing authorities. So in Duke Energy Carolinas, for the top 5 peaking hours in the past 8 years, around 40% of those occurred in the wintertime. But if you take a larger sample of the peak hours, that share substantially drops. So the top 10 hours, only 20% of those for Duke Energy Carolinas occurred in winter months. And then if you take the top 100 hours, it's actually a little closer to 10%. Now it's a different story for Duke Energy Progress. They are a more substantially winter peaking system, and this is clear. So top 5 hours, 100% of those were in winter months. Top 10 hours, around 90%. And then the top 100, 85%. Now, whether or not you would characterize that as a solely winter peaking system, this is a little bit open to interpretation. It sort of depends on how much data you're sampling. So are you only talking about, the max peak hour over the past 8 years, or are you looking at a larger sample to get a sense of the broader picture? And so is it fully winter peaking? Would you say it's 85% winter peaking? You can kind of have a reasonable debate around how to characterize it. For Dominion, South Carolina, it is, based on this data set, it is likely reasonable to characterize it as a predominantly summer peaking system, and that 0% of the top 5 hours since 2005 occurred in the wintertime, 0% occurred in the top 10 hours, and only around 10% of those peak load hours since 2015 occurred in the winter months. And then back to Santee, more substantially winter peaking, right? Kind of similar profile to Duke Energy Progress, 100% of those top 5 hours, nearly 100% of the top 10. It does drop off when you look at the top 100, so that is a pretty interesting data point too. But certainly you would characterize that as more of a winter peaking system than Dominion or Duke Energy Carolinas. I thought it'd also just be useful to note here which of these have had their records set in the past year. So you can see several of these, their new records were just set either by that December 24th Winter Storm Elliott event or by this summer's very, very high temperatures, right, and an increase in peak loads. So you can see which of those are the new records. So that is the perspective on sort of the share of hours occurring in the wintertime. And I know this looks a little complicated, but it's actually, once I explain, I think it's actually relatively simple. I find it very instructive. And so we have a version of this for each of the balancing authorities that we just spoke about. And so what we're looking at here is 1 month of load data, both in the wintertime and the summertime for each of these balancing authorities. So the one we're looking at right now, this is Duke Energy Carolinas. So the blue line represents their load in the month from December 17th to January 16th of this past year, right? So December 17th, 2022 to January 16th, 2023, inclusive of that peak that occurred during Winter Storm Elliott, which you can see sort of poking up there, right? And the bottom here, this is in hours, right? So there's around 730 hours in a month. So it's not labeled by days, just to simplify the representation. The orange line is the load data from this summer July 17th to August 16th. And so what we can see, right, is that the winter peak is generally lower on an average basis than the summer peak. So you have, and this kind of characterizes the nature of these winter peaking events, right? They occur in extremity when you have these very particular extreme winter weather systems, whereas the summer peaks on average are higher and they tend to be closer or tighter in how far they are from the maximum summer peak that's set. And so when we can actually quantify this, so you can see on the bottom left, so the average peak for this winter month was about 15 gigawatts. This is for DEC. And for the summer, it was 18.2 gigawatts. And then the overall peak you can see for winter and summer. And then you just divide the two, and so the winter average peak is only 72% of that overall winter peak, whereas the summer peak is 86% of that summer peak. And again, the point it just being that the winter peaks, they're much more spiky generally, and they occur on a much shorter time period, whereas summer peaks tend to be more robust throughout the summer and closer to the overall peak. So the next few slides are the same representation of data, but for all the other balancing authorities. So this is Duke Energy Progress. We don't need to go through every data point here, but you can see there, and so this is the more winter peaking system. You can see during that Winter Storm Elliott, December 24th, that the winter peak, that really set the peak between the two, and it's higher than the summer peak that they experienced, which is over there to the right. But nevertheless, it's the same sort of effect. So if we look at these percentages, so the average winter peak, even for DEP being a predominantly winter peaking system, is about 70%, whereas in the summertime, that average is 88%. And then if we go to the next slide, same representation, but for Dominion, South Carolina, and actually the disparity here in that percent of peak, the average as a percent of the overall peak, is even starker. Again, partly because it is such a more predominantly summer peaking system. You can see 68% for the wintertime, and then 88% for the summertime, again, for these two load months. And then the next slide is, again, the same representation for Sandy Cooper, and similar, again, disparity in that average versus the overall peak, 70% versus 92%. So with that grounding, we'll now shift gears to talk a little bit more specifically about the relationship of solar and summer peaks, just because I think it's very important for kind of contextualizing resource adequacy, And so here again, we will start with kind of zooming out, looking at the U.S. at large. So this is, again, the lower 48 states. This is this summer's peak for the whole country. So it's the week of July 24th. And so we're looking at, again, the overall demand, as well as, in this case, the generation that's occurring in aggregate for all the lower 48 states. And so you can see there on the sort of right-hand side, that's the overall peak there on that Thursday, July 27th, that peak being there at 742 gigawatts. And so that white sort of dotted line, that represents the load. And then the rest of the colored sort of wavy lines or volumes are the generation for each of these technologies. So simply for the sake of simplified visual representation here, we've combined all the thermal resources into one. So that's just sort of the brown mix there. And then above that is the hydropower there in blue, and then the wind, and then the solar. And you can start to see, it's hard to see it really precisely with this representation, but you can see there's kind of this nice correlation that's occurring between the maximum or near maximum daily output for that solar and the wind, actually, in this case, in alignment with that summer peak load. And especially in the case of solar, this makes intuitive sense, right? When you have the hottest summer days are those that are generally the sunniest, right? Sort of makes sense. So in general, we will see summer peaks occurring on days that have the most robust solar generation on average. And there can be obviously a little variation. You might have a little bit more cloud cover on even a hot day, an especially hot day. But that's the general correlation that we see. And so in this case, we're now at a point where so wind and solar on that maximum peak hour at 742 gigawatts contributed 12%. Actually, sorry, the 12% is actually for the average peak that occurred over the course of this week. So on average during this peaking week, wind and solar contributed 12% or about 86 gigawatts during that coincident peak load hour of 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern. So that's kind of zoomed out the U.S. at large, and now so we'll zoom in here, and it's a little easier to do this if we look at one or two balancing authorities combined, rather than try to look at, just because there's so much sort of going on here, than to look at all balancing authorities at once. But what I have done here though is combined both of the Duke balancing authorities. So this is on that peak day, right, July 27th of 2023. This is the aggregate load and the aggregate generation across both Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress. And so what we can see is that, that peak, again, sort of hit in that 5 to 6 p.m. range. You've got, of course, the nuclear baseload, running steady, very consistent. Above the nuclear, you've got the coal, also certainly more steady than the gas, although you do see some fluctuation there. And by the way, this is a relatively standard, summer peaking day sort of profile. You'll see, a little bit of fluctuation in the coal. Then you see the gas. Obviously, the gas ramps a lot more. It's a more flexible resource, and so you see that peak in the late afternoon, early evening. And then in this case, you do see substantially more hydro output occurring in the late afternoon, early evening. Presumably a substantial portion of that is the pumped hydro resource that's being utilized. You do see a little bit of, there's a little bit of biomass here in the mix, and other might be a little bit of petro in there as well. And then you see the solar, and it's a little hard, when you look at this representation, can't quite tell where exactly is the solar output maxing out, but we know, generally on average it will max out somewhere between 12 to 2 p.m. depending on the day. It can be a little bit more, a little bit later sometimes, but generally that's what we'll see. And so if we zoom in a little further and just look at this in another way. So this is one day, right? 1 day of generation. So I know this looks complicated first, but I think it's a valuable way of slicing this. So what we've done here is same system, right? So this is the Duke combined system, DP and DEC. So we're looking at the aggregate load for those two systems and the aggregate solar output. But instead of looking at it on only 1 day, we're looking at it for 10 days. And the 10 days that we're looking at are the 10 most peaking days this summer across the Duke system. So we took all of the summer days from the summer, and then we rank ordered them by the peak load that was hit for the combined Duke system. And then we took the top 10, right? Okay, so top 10 peaking days on Duke's combined system this summer. And then we took the solar output that occurred on those days, and we've overlaid it, right? And to make it more easy to visualize, we have two different sort of scales going on here. So the load matches up with the right-hand axis, right? So it's a scale that you would expect, right? So it's a little over 30 gigawatts, 30,000 megawatts is the sort of peak combined between the two. And then the solar is aligned with the left-hand axis. You certainly wouldn't expect the solar to be beating 25 gigawatts, right? So that sort of explains why the solar sort of appears to be as high as the load. It's just that it's aligned with a different axis. And the only reason to do that is it just makes it a little bit easier to do a comparison. Because if you didn't, you'd have the solar way down at the bottom, and it'd be this sort of small bump, and then you'd have the load way up here. And so what you can see, though, is that there is this nice correlation, again, just between these summer peaking time periods and the maximum solar output. And you can see pretty nice consistency, right, in the shape of those solar output profiles. You do have variation, right? There are a couple instances where you had a little dip right in the middle of the day. There was probably some cloud cover that occurred there. You don't see any spikes, though, right? It's not like in any single hour, right, you see solar, drop to 25%. What you see are generally smooth curves. You'll see a little bit of variation at the top, but otherwise the profiles are relatively consistent. And this makes sense, right? When you think about the way this, solar output occurs across a balancing authority with a large number of solar generators. In this case, these are all utility scale. I should keep saying that. So all this is utility scale. So you have a very geographically diversified resource, right? So you have these solar power plants all over the place. And so it's very hard to have an instance, especially on a relatively hot day, where you're going to see a big spike in output, because even if there is intermittent cloud coverage, you're only going to see that cloud coverage impact, a select minority of those solar generators.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Caston has a question.
Oh, yeah, of course.
I wanted to make sure I understood your y-axis again.
Sure.
The one on the, I guess my left at 3,000, 5,500. And what is that again?
Yeah. So the left axis is aligned with the solar output here. And so the way to interpret it is that the solar output is reaching a maximum of approximately 3,500 megawatts on any of these days. And so the left-hand axis, that is really supposed to be aligned with the solar output, whereas the load, when you look at those load curves on the top, and you're trying to figure out how much does that actually represent, you look at the right-hand axis. And this just allows us to overlay two different data sets in a way that's a little bit more visually interpretable, if that makes sense.
That's what I thought it was. Yeah. I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah,
thank you.
Sure thing. And so the general point being that you see a relatively smooth profile. You don't see these spikes because, again, even if you have some degree of intermittent cloud cover, you have such a geographic diversity of these solar generators that you're not going to see very large variation. And in the other case, right, so on the other end of the spectrum, if it wasn't just intermittent cloud coverage, it was very heavy cloud coverage, we wouldn't be having this conversation, right, because it wouldn't be a summer peak day. Because, of course, if it's a cloudy day, it's not going to be a summer peaking day. And the other thing about more consistent heavy cloud coverage is those weather systems are much more predictable. Right? So we can see usually days in advance, right, if there's going to be a consistent cloud coverage emerging. These don't just sort of appear out of nowhere. So in that sense, consistent cloud coverage is much more predictable and sort of considering our dispatch strategy, even several days out. So that's sort of looking at, if we're looking at multiple summer peaking days. There we go. And this is just another way of looking at that same data. And so what we're looking at here is it's the same, so the same 10 days, and we've taken, so on the bottom, you see the timestamp on each of those peak load hours for those 10 peak days. It's interesting because it's relatively consistent, right? You can see most of them occur in the hour ending at 5 p.m. Eastern. A couple of them are 4 p.m. And then there are a couple outliers. One is at 3 p.m. and the other's at 6 p.m. Very, very rare. I don't know that I've ever seen for this system a peak occur outside of this range, 3 to 6. Generally, it's concentrated around 5 p.m. and then you have a little bit of variation around it. And then in each of those hours, this is how much solar generation was occurring. And then what we have is we've looked at the share of that solar generation occurring in that peak load hour as a share of that day's maximum solar output. And so that's the percentage line, which aligns with the right-hand axis. And so what we can see here is that generally the solar output on these summer peak days is usually a greater than 75% of their maximum daily production. So another way of saying this is that what we see is relative consistency in achieving a meaningful contribution from the solar generators in the peak load hour as compared to the maximum amount that those solar generators output in any given day, right? So it's not like we see the peaks occurring in the summer at a time when solar generation has dropped to 10% of its maximum output profile, or even 20 or even 30. It's really generally more in the range of above 75%. The only exception to that in this case is this sort of outlier day where the peak is occurring and the hour ending at 6 p.m. And even in that case, you're still seeing that solar output at 50% of its maximum for that day. All right. And so when now we've zoomed back in, right, to our favorite peak day from 2023, July 27th for the combined Duke system. And I'm sure you all have heard of the sort of terminology of net load versus gross load, but just to sort of recap on what's going on here. So the gross load curve, which is the red one, that's the aggregate load curve. That's what we've been looking at thus far for each of these utilities. So the total load that's occurring for this combined Duke system on July 27th. The net load, all we're doing here is we're taking the gross load and we're subtracting the solar output in each of those hours. So net load is just that top line minus the solar output, which you can see there at the bottom, right? It's visible. It's not some extreme contribution, but that's what's going on. So we oftentimes use this term net load, and that it's the load that has to be made up by these resources that don't have a zero dispatch cost, is the way it works, at least in ISO RTOs. But it's a way of thinking about what's the leftover load that we have to make up after we've accounted for this resource contribution. And so when we look at it that way, what we see is that, again, sort of on a representative summer peak day, we will see that net load narrow and reduce, right? So the net load, it declines in its aggregate volume by several gigs. And then it also, instead of being a sort of flatter, 4 to even 6 hour sort of top curve, it becomes a narrower peak. And this is important, right? Because that means our challenge of shaving that net peak load has become easier, right? So suddenly, instead of having a 4 to 6 hour peak that we've got to supply, we now have a peak, what we call a net load, a net peak, that is much narrower. And of course, it would be even narrower the more solar that we have on the system. It makes the job easier, right? It makes the job easier meeting that summer peak on these summer peaking days. So if we go to the next, let's see here. All right. There we go. So I think we could look at a lot of different systems, right, to look at this effect, right, of how summer peaks are sort of playing out and the resource mix and their interaction and diversity, I thought it's valuable to look at ERCOT just because, of course, they've had a lot of attention in recent years for reliability concern. And of course, they've had reliability concern even this summer, right? They've also hit their maximum record peak loads, and they've been scrambling, right, to get enough generation capacity on the system so they can meet these summer peaks. And we'll look at this next slide, but I mean, ERCOT is just moving at a breakneck pace right now to try to interconnect more capacity, more of these resources of all kinds, right? A diverse mix so that they can meet these ever-growing summer peaks that are occurring. And so this is ERCOT's generation mix and their demand, their load curve for, it's actually similarly July 29th to August 2nd of this year. And interestingly, at the time, this was, I think, the record that was hit. Actually interesting that it occurred, well, I guess it was early in the week, that Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. But what you can see is that this diversity of resources is essential for them to meet their growing peaks. So if they didn't, in this case, if they didn't have every single one of these resources acting in concert with each other, they would have had rolling blackouts occur. They did not have enough thermal capacity to meet their summer peaks. And so in that sense, I mean, solar, and to some extent wind, but especially solar, given, as you can see, the overlap of the solar production with their maximum demand peaks, solar has played an essential role in ERCOT this summer in avoiding more rolling blackouts. And just, on that point of that ERCOT moving at a breakneck pace to try to get more generation on the system, you can see this. It's remarkable, right? So this is the interconnected capacity by most markets in the U.S. over the past 2 years, and so these are in megawatts, and so you can see ERCOT on the left-hand side there. They interconnected around 8,000 megawatts in 2021. They interconnected 6,000 megawatts last year, substantially exceeding every market outside ISO-RTO. That includes all the Southeast and all of the West, right? That is not part of organized markets. And it's very instructive. It'd be even better, right, if we had some way of sort of qualifying this by the size of these systems, right? But to give you one point of comparison, PJM has a peak load that is approximately twice as large as ERCOT's, and yet their interconnection pace was about 2.5 times less than ERCOT's in aggregate over the past 2 years. So ERCOT is doing something very interesting here, right? And just in terms of their ability to interconnect more resources to meet growing demand and ensure reliability. And no doubt they have reliability challenges, but their ability to interconnect more resources is part of how they are ensuring resource adequacy and mitigating the chance of rolling blackouts. So now we'll shift gears a little bit and talk a bit more about the winter resource adequacy picture. So we've talked a lot about winter versus summer and these trends in winter versus summer peaks. We've talked about summer peaking events and how it interacts with solar generation and then net load and so some of those interactive effects. Now we'll talk about winter resource adequacy. And we won't go into nearly the level of detail here on winter resource. We could have a whole session, I think, just on winter resource adequacy. But I think we'll at least hit some of the high points, and of course we can always go into more detail as you'd like. So this is just a reminder for all of us, kind of high level, that we have seen some fairly unprecedented weather-related reliability events in the past few years. And so these are some of the ones that have caught the most headlines. There have been a few others, but and one of them was, of course, during summer, and Kaisa, that was in August 2020. Of course, in ERCOT, Winter Storm Uri in February 2021, and then here in the Southeast, especially the impact being felt for Winter Storm Elliott in December 2022, where we had sort of an unprecedented set of rolling blackouts. And there are a variety of factors that are contributing to these relatively challenging reliability conditions. And this is in no particular order, but these are some of the factors. And I know you all have heard, I think you had a nice presentation from NERC earlier this year talking about resource adequacy and reliability. I think they covered some of this as well. But just to think about a couple of these, right? So the first one here, in terms of the very heavy reliance increasingly on natural gas. So let's start by saying, right, the shift from coal to gas, as we all know, has brought meaningful benefits, right? Lower costs, higher flexibility in our systems, lower emissions, lower local pollutants. You know, the list, we could probably go on. However, right, as gas becomes the dominant fuel source increasingly across a larger number of jurisdictions, as with any effect where you become overly dependent on any single resource, this does introduce certain considerations around resource adequacy risk. And of course, Winter Storm Uri is sort of the poster child of this dynamic, right? And so, you know, Texas, it has a lot of renewables, but really Texas is a gas state. They have over 50%, or approximately 50% of its electricity is coming from gas. And I'm sure you all are aware, but, you know, the official, I'll pause because I guess I'm not supposed to reference external reports. I will say, based on my knowledge, that that the conclusion was that approximately 60% of all of the unplanned outages, derates, or false starts during that event came from gas generators. That totaled approximately 107 gigawatts of gas. And so, you know, the gas infrastructure wasn't ready, right? It wasn't weatherized, it wasn't winterized. And there were other resources that had outages too, right? It wasn't just gas, but it was the majority share and was a very substantial contribution. But even in a scenario where you have perfect weatherization, right, of every, and by the way, you'll have probably been briefed in other contexts that there is better weatherization of gas generators on average in a jurisdiction like the Southeast as compared to other markets. But, you know, even in a scenario with perfect weatherization of all of these generators, you know, a very heavy dependence on gas can still introduce resource adequacy risk, right? And the most basic reason for this is just supply and demand, right? There's a lot of demand for gas in electric power, of course, but also in the industrial sector, in the commercial sector, and the residential sector for a variety of applications. And that demand only grows during extreme weather events, right? So if it's very hot or it's very cold, this demand for gas goes up across a variety of sectors, not just electric power. And ultimately, there's a finite supply, right? We know that we have a limited pipeline infrastructure issue. It's extremely difficult to site new pipelines. Of course, we'll see how that plays out in years to come. And, you know, other portions of the supply chain and the operations are susceptible to potential disruption. So that's just one factor, again, among several here that's contributing to these reliability conditions. Of course, the pace of retirements of other generators, especially those that are more expensive. This creates a challenge of just needing, again, to get more capacity onto the system more quickly so that we can replace that capacity. You know, in some regions, certainly, if there was more interregional transmission during certain reliability events, you may be able to mitigate some of these occurrences, and so that was certainly the case with Winter Storm Uri, with ERCOT, and it may have been the case with Winter Storm Elliott to a certain degree too. If you looked at jurisdictions like MISO, obviously didn't have nearly the same level of blackouts. You know, theoretically, if there had been more interregional transmission capacity, those could have helped to mitigate those reliability events. And then, of course, the other factor here is just in general the increasing weather dependency of the system. That does apply to fossil generators, but of course it's relevant to wind and solar, and we'll talk more specifically now about winter peaking events and the interplay with solar. So I imagine you've probably seen a version of this chart perhaps before. So this is, again, back to the combined Duke system. By the way, not in any way picking on Duke, it's just that I think the data is a little bit more instructive, just given the scale of the system, so you can see these effects sort of playing out at an aggregate level. And so this is December 24th of last year, and this is just a representation of each generation source before and after and during the blackouts occurred. And so I think there are a whole number of things that are notable about this. There's a lot going on. It's a lot to try to interpret. But one place to start, so first off, we know, these winter morning peaks, as we said, are somewhere between generally 6 to 8 to 9 a.m. That is, of course, when the blackouts began occurring. That is when there was a mismatch between the load and the supply. And so that, the sort of first point of contextualization here. And so when we zoom in on that kind of 6 to 8 a.m. period, a few things are going on. The first that I find notable is that the coal production, right, it does drop off at a time you would not expect. So it's actually, the coal production, interestingly, was actually higher in the earlier morning hours than it was in the later morning hours, and it drops off just as the blackouts sort of start occurring, and you have that mismatch between load and supply. So that's sort of one interesting effect here. The gas, it looks, at least from this representation, to obviously it's spiking right when you need it, right there in that winter morning. Although we did later learn that there were gas generators from a variety of entities that were not accessible and available to contribute towards that peak. The other thing you notice here, which is important, is that pumped hydro is playing a critical role, right? And so the hydro is there when you need it. It ramps up right there during that winter morning peak. I feel like pumped hydro may have been one of the unsung heroes of this event, and most likely the blackouts would have been substantially worse if not for that resource. And so when we think about the role of pumped hydro here, it's very illustrative for how we can think about the role of storage in supporting winter resource adequacy. And so if we back up here, so December 24th, that's when the blackouts actually occur. But if we go to the day before, and we can see, so clearly the pumped hydro is charging very substantially on those early morning hours of December 23rd, right? It goes below zero, which means it's charging. It's worth noting that because this is combining pumped hydro and other hydro output, I don't think we can actually tell all of the hours when pumped hydro is charging here. It'd actually be even better if we could actually get a singular representation of its charge and discharge profile, because this includes other hydro resources. So it's charging early morning on December 23rd. And it's interesting to think about this because, of course, the solar it doesn't generate in the winter mornings, right? So we know that. But if we start with December 23rd, so let's say you didn't have the solar output during that midday, you would have had to make up that energy generation, right? So the solar was contributing to load on December 23rd. If it hadn't been there, you would have had to make up for it. And you would have had to make up for it in really one of three ways. You can't run the nuclear. The nuclear is already maxed out, right? You don't have any more biomass resources. So either you'd have to run the gas more and use limited and very valuable gas fuel, in this case, in a lead up to an extreme reliability event, or you'd have to run the coal, and there too, right, you have limited sort of valuable coal resource that you're trying to conserve to support the impending maximum peak. or you'd have to have run the discharge the pumped hydro during that midday. So the point being that even in the lead up to the actual blackout event, the solar output here, which was quite robust, right? These are actually relatively clear days. The solar output helps to conserve other fuels so that they can support the impending peak event. And then this plays out again right on December 24th. So, so the rolling blackouts start occurring. There's uncertainty as to whether we could see another maximum load event occur on the next day, which would contribute to more rolling blackouts, right? So there's this scramble to mobilize on the day of December 24th to avoid another set of rolling blackouts on the next day. And so that's why they're racing right there to get the pumped hydro stored again. And in this case, the charging of the pumped hydro overlays almost exactly with the maximum solar output. And so, in this case, you actually had, you could sort of, again, electrons are fungible, right? But you could say that, the solar is directly contributing to the pumped hydro charging. And even if it hadn't, again, it would be a fuel conserving resource as you head into a potential next max peak event on the next day and to try to avoid more blackouts. And I think what all this sort of neatly illustrates is that what we call sort of diversity benefits or synergistic benefits of different resources working in interaction with one another with different profiles, right? So you can just kind of think about it as a team, right? We've got a team of different players that we put on the field, and they each bring slightly different strengths and weaknesses, but working together, they can help to mitigate even winter resource adequacy events. And so, I know we're maybe starting to go a little over time, so I'll go through these last slides a little bit more quickly. And so now we've zoomed in right on just the day of December 24th. You can see that load curve, that demand curve there. You can see the net generation. You can see the gap, right? So that the gap there between the net generation, and we don't have the imports here, by the way, but generally we can consider that gap between the net generation and the demand. That's what caused these rolling blackouts, and we can see that there is this, again, very sort of interesting, very sort of peaky profile to these winter peaks. And just purely for illustrative purposes, right, we can just sort of overlay the discharge profile of lithium-ion batteries at different durations, right? So the shortest, right, that you can get 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours. If you had, in this case, a couple gigawatts, to demonstrate how they could contribute to mitigating those blackouts by supporting that peak event. And so there's been, I think, really valuable efforts to attempt to actually quantify these, what we call diversity benefits or synergistic benefits between different resources. So we can talk about them generally, right? And we can see them as we look at these peaking days, but can we actually quantify what the diversity benefit is of the interaction between these different resources? And so this is actually this was presented and filed before this commission in, I believe it's the 2019 Duke IRP docket. And there's a lot more that could be said here, but the basic point that this particular study was attempting to quantify is, and I can try to characterize all these charts. So basically what's going on here is that, so you have Duke Energy Carolinas, you have Duke Energy Progress. You start with the solar-only capacity value. The acronym is ELCC. It stands for Effective Load Carrying Capability. So it's a measure of the capacity value of the resource. You start with the solar. It's 4,500 megawatts. It's only rated at, in this case, 600 megawatts of ELCC value for DEC. You add 1,600 megawatts of batteries. That adds a meaningful amount of capacity value, but it's also not maxed out. And then they did a bunch of modeling and simulation to identify the diversity benefit between the interaction between those two resources. And that's how they come up with the aggregate ELCC of these two combined, which is on the right-hand side, both for Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress. And so this study was conducted by E3. And I would just say, in this, the foresight of this commission, this next slide is from, this was filed before this commission in the recent Duke IRP, so I'm not commenting on it in any sort of evaluative way. It's just to show you the data. And this is the first time, at least to my awareness, that a utility has filed a study that looks at these diversity benefits between these two resources, in this case between solar and storage. And the reason we're able to look at this today is thanks to the foresight of this commission, because it was this commission which requested that in the next round of resource planning that there be a study that evaluates these diversity benefits. So now we have the analysis for the first time that's not from an independent intervener. And I think it's a really valuable analysis, and I would say it's perfect. I'm sure there are things that can be critiqued about it, but I think it's very valuable, and it generally confirms the findings of E3. And so what's going on here? This is kind of the crux of the analysis right here. This is specific to Duke Energy Carolinas for the winter time. So they're trying to quantify the capacity value, or the ELCC, of storage under different scenarios. And so on the left hand, you start with the lowest penetration of storage and PV. And so what you're actually looking at, this is the storage capacity value and the impact that solar penetration has on that storage capacity value. So we're not looking at the solar capacity value, it's only the storage, but it's the impact of more solar on the capacity value of the storage. And so when you have a lower penetration of storage, in this case 1.2 gigawatts, the average capacity value of that storage is nearly 100%. So that's helpful. When you add incrementally more storage up to 2.3 gigawatts in that second set of bars, you would expect the capacity value on average declines, right? And that's just because you have shaved the peak effectively, right? You've shaved it, you've narrowed it, you've made the challenge easier to resolve. And so each incremental megawatt of storage going forward from there will have a slightly lower contribution. But what we see is that when you account for solar being on the system and in ever higher volumes, the capacity value of the storage actually grows with each increment. And so when you get to these sort of higher penetrations, instead of having a capacity value of on average of 75% approximately for the storage, you would see that rise to nearly 90%. And just to sort of read a direct quote from the study, which I think just valuable and sort of sums it up, it said, "There is synergistic benefit between solar and storage resources because the resources work together to increase their value from a resource adequacy perspective. After adding a fixed solar profile, the net peak load is typically narrower, allowing for short duration storage to better serve the new net peak load." And that really wraps us out. I had included this slide just in case it was valuable as a reference. I know you all have seen this. It's just a representation of the outages. This is specific to Duke Energy Progress in this case that occurred on December 24th. But this is really just for reference purposes. And with that, I think I've concluded my presentation and very happy to take any of your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Norris. Commissioner Carolee Williams.
Thank you, Chair Belzer. Thank you very much. I'm going to jump in first because I may have to be impolite and leave to get to another meeting. And I'm going to take you first to page 27 and what you were just talking about. Sure. I think I followed it, but I'd love to hear you talk specifically about the 6 gigawatt PV, the 8 gigawatt PV, and the relationship of the same storage because the results look the same to me. And so I can't tell you what I think it means, and so I'm still struggling to take that in a little bit better. Does
Right.
that make sense?
Yes.
My question, at least.
Yeah, yeah, and it's an important observation. So, and I'll caveat by saying I won't claim to represent all of the findings for this particular study in this regard, but I'll attempt to explain my interpretation of what that represents and why
Right.
that's
I'm
happening.
just asking you about why the relationship
Sure.
might be there.
Yeah. So I think, and sort of subject to Jay, I think what's going on here is that it actually sort of goes back to why we see an incremental decline in the capacity value as we add more storage, in that at a certain point of penetration, you've effectively resolved that resource adequacy risk, right? You've shaved the peak so much that even with, in this case, additional solar, the solar can't further shave the peak. Now, I will say there are a couple. So one interpretation is that the peak has already been so shaved that even adding more PV, if it would have otherwise added capacity value, that it's not anymore because it's already been shaved. So that's one interpretation. The other interpretation is, and this is also possible, is that so what happens is when you're going up to 6 gigawatts of the PV is contributing to a narrowing of the net peak. So we saw that effect, right? As the solar was growing, you saw the net peak decline and narrow. There's a point at which you can keep adding more solar, but the marginal impact in terms of the reduction and the narrowing of the net peak just it decline. It goes almost to zero, right? You might get a little bit more marginal value with each increment, but the marginal impact does fall. So that's the other interpretation. It might actually be a mix of those two, but I hope that helps. There is, of course. Let me add one more point, because actually what you've hit on here I think is really important. So that's the finding from the methodology and the inputs that were used for this particular study. Just from my personal standpoint as a researcher, I have questions about, is there another layer of analysis that could be conducted here that would explore all the various dynamics? Because what I don't know that's being accounted for here is the fuel saving effect that we talked about, right? So if you're conserving scarce fuels in a way that allows those fuel reliant generators to better and more reliably contribute to the peak when it occurs, that is not accounted for here. This is only looking at the interactive effect of the solar and the storage on the winter peak. So I think it's valuable analysis. It captures some of the important interactive effects here. Just based on my initial read of it, I don't know that we should conclude that it's sort of the end-all, be-all in terms of the consideration of interactive effects.
Thank you. My only other question has to do with, on page 10, the kind of surprising results, really thinking about Dominion Energy South Carolina and Santee Cooper and where they lie geographically. And then thinking about, we've got Duke Energy Carolinas and Duke Energy Progress, but they are North Carolina and South Carolina, if I heard you correctly.
It's combined. Yeah.
And so Duke Energy Progress in South Carolina is geographically kind of similar to Dominion and Santee Cooper, but as I recall, in North Carolina, it includes the mountainous section, the northeast section of North Carolina. Would that explain? No. I don't. I guess.
Oh no, sorry, I wasn't answering.
No.
Maybe I should comment on one part that you
Please
mentioned.
do.
So you raise a really important point, which is how EIA actually accounts for DEP east and west.
Ah.
And so I would subject to check. I believe that based on their balancing authority accounting, this is DEP East. So I don't know this actually does include DEP. Now it's a very small portion of the load. So I don't, even if you accounted for DEP West, I would be very surprised if it materially changed these results. But we would need to confirm whether, again, just the EIA, and it's interesting because in some of their balancing authority accounting, they combine the two, and others they don't. I cannot recall off the top of my head for this particular one if it incorporated the west portion. So I think to your ultimate question, though, I don't think that, or I would be surprised if something that explains the discrepancy between DEP and DEC has to do with whether or not DEP West is incorporated. And to your point,
And just to
yeah.
clarify, I think my point really is, why is, with DEP, now that we know that it's east, and Dominion, South Carolina, and Santee, geographically similar, probably housing stock kind of similar, why the difference between Dominion and the other two?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I can't claim to have a really good answer for you. There's no doubt that the makeup of the load just plays a really important role. So, for example, so in this case we're talking about summer. If we were talking about winter, we would be thinking about, so how many inefficient sort of electric heaters do we have on the system, especially on the residential side, right? These can play a pretty significant, more than you would think, right? They can contribute to a winter peak. Now, in this case, we're talking about the summer peak. And so, you might ask the question of, well, is there some meaningful difference occurring here with respect to HVAC efficiency, or just the nature of the HVAC demand across residential, commercial, industrial? Ideally, you'd want to get a breakdown of what's actually contributing to these summer peaks, and yeah. So, but in this case, I would say that there was a winter load study that was conducted a few years ago, and I think that was for Duke Systems. So that might be instructive to help explain some of these discrepancies.
Thank you very much. And as someone told me yesterday, I appreciate your candor that, you weren't exactly sure, why in that circumstance, but then applying your knowledge to it. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Commissioners?
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Justin Williams?
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Norris, I see you go to a school that I'm familiar with. How long have you been at Duke? What year are you?
Yeah, I've just started my PhD.
Oh, okay. You're going to be there for a while.
That's right.
Okay, good stuff. I appreciate your presentation as it highlights all of the benefits. I'm just wondering if you noticed any detriments or neutral observations as it relates to solar.
Detriments or neutral observations?
Right. You spoke about the benefits.
Sure.
But anything that is not that you observed through your research that could go one way or the other, maybe could create an issue.
And just so I just want to make sure I understand the question. When you say issue, do you mean specifically for resource adequacy?
Yes, sir. Or
Yes.
maybe, and when I say issue, a concern, something that may be concerning.
Sure. So one of those, I think it does go back to this question of the predictability of weather events. And so if we think about the kind of spectrum of weather that we can see occur, let's say limiting it to the summer to start. So if we have intermittent cloud coverage, this, generally we would expect to see not major variation in the solar output, But this depends on the nature of the system and how many generators we have, right? So if we're on a smaller system and we have a smaller number of utility scale solar generators and they are more geographically proximate, then it's possible, right, that even intermittent cloud coverage could cause more of a drop in solar output during any given hour. And so that concern is especially acute when you have a smaller system with a smaller number of solar generators. So I think that's one. The other is, when you do have obviously blanket cloud coverage, this obviously impacts your resource profile, and your ability to predict those events is obviously strongly correlated with how good your weather prediction system is, right? So if you have good weather prediction, you can plan for that blanket cloud coverage, ideally multiple days in advance. I'm not a meteorologist, right? So I can't speak to how often it occurs that we have blanket cloud coverage on an unexpected basis, more than a day or two in advance. It's possible that in certain scenarios that occurs. And so I would say that this issue of predictability is one that you may want to explore further, again, to assess this question of whether we can rely on solar meaningfully for resource adequacy in summer months. The empirical data, again, based on the actual generation data during the summer peaks, does suggest that it is relatively consistent. But if you're trying to account for all possible weather scenarios, you want a larger sample size, and you want to model, you want to simulate more weather years, and that's what you would do, right, under a proper loss of load expectation analysis. You're looking at up to 35 years of weather data, and you're simulating its interaction with load to actually look at where your loss of load expectation is concentrated. And so I don't want to go on too long in response to your, but I will mention just one other thing, which I think is important to contextualize here, is that whether or not a system is peaking in one season or another does not tell you necessarily where its loss of load expectation is concentrated. And so that's a much more complex analysis, right, that involves all these sort of Monte Carlo simulations, and could sort of go into it a little further if you want to. But so those are two I would highlight. With respect to resource adequacy, now there's a whole other category of reliability services that, we could have a whole briefing on, right, with respect to the profile of inverter-based resources and how they compare to others, and providing inertia to the system, and so there's a whole other category of reliability services that go well beyond resource adequacy. And so what we focus on here is resource adequacy, but yeah, if we wanted to explore other reliability services, we would want to have a separate briefing on those.
Okay. My only other question is in reference to the graph you have on page 5, VRE share of annual utility scale electricity generation by state. I noticed that South Carolina is 2.4%, and our neighbors to the north and neighbors to the south are probably at least twice that, it seems to me, from reading your graph. Do you have any analysis or comment on the room for growth for solar resources in South Carolina, based on your report here?
Sure. Here? So it would seem like, based on, as you note, the level of penetration that we're seeing in even neighboring states, some of which have substantially higher overall demand, that the system could accommodate more solar generation while maintaining, or in some cases, potentially even enhancing resource adequacy, again, depending on the profile of the system. So from a resource adequacy standpoint, I think, taking this data all together, it would suggest that the system in South Carolina can accommodate more solar without a resource adequacy risk at this juncture. Now, when you're talking about substantially higher rates of penetration, especially towards the average here or towards the those states with the highest rates of solar penetration, it becomes a different question, and you need to consider other factors. But that would be my overall takeaway.
And the average here, the average is it 13.7 or what's the average?
That's right. So the 13.7, it's really the total penetration for the whole. So if we take all solar and wind generation in the U.S. and we divide it by the overall generation, that's 13.7%.
Okay. I mean, without running the numbers, would it be fair to assume that would be lower for solar, since I see at the bottom of your chart wind has a significant amount of penetration? Exactly
right. Yeah, so the wind is, so of that 13.7%, wind is about 10% of that.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate your testimony.
Commissioners? Mr. Norris, Ms. Brooks Neffley, thank you both very much for your presentations today. I think you've given us a good bit to think about, and I can speak for myself and say you've clarified some issues for me as well. So I appreciate your appearances here today and y'all putting this presentation together to brief us. So with that, we will close this proceeding and wish everyone a good day. So we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you very much.